Today's story delves into three tragic cases of young women whose lives were stolen in unimaginable ways. First, the shocking murder of Bianca Devins, a 17-year-old whose death was exploited online in one of the most disturbing cases of social media misuse. Next, the mysterious death of Lavina Johnson, a soldier found dead under suspicious circumstances on a military base, leaving behind unanswered questions and cries for justice. Finally, the heartbreaking murder of Maria Lauterbach, a Marine betrayed by a fellow soldier, reveals the systemic failures within the military to protect its own. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. Sunday night at Pizza Plus was like so many before it, bustling with activity and filled with the comforting hum of conversation and laughter. Valerie Looney, a longtime manager, moved swiftly through the dining room, balancing plates with effortless grace and offering warm smiles to every customer she passed. She was a pillar of this tight-knit mountain town, where the small community felt more like an extended family. Her husband, Harvey, worked diligently in the kitchen, his broad frame and thick beard giving him an unassuming, steady presence. Together, they embodied the heart and soul of the restaurant. But as the evening wore on, a sinister undercurrent began to ripple beneath the surface of this ordinary night. By 10:00 p.m., the last of the patrons had left, and the restaurant grew quiet, save for the faint clatter of dishes and the rhythmic swish of a mop as Brian Lee, a young and irritable employee, grudgingly cleaned the floors. Valerie worked at the front counter, diligently counting the day's earnings, while Harvey tidied up in the kitchen. The couple exchanged light-hearted banter, their anticipation for their upcoming anniversary evident in their smiles. As the clock ticked closer to closing time, Harvey grabbed a bucket of ice and headed out the back door to empty it onto the patch of grass behind the building. The air outside was crisp and still, the surrounding woods cloaked in darkness. Harvey bent over to catch his breath, the physical exertion of even small tasks weighing on him more these days. His moment of solitude was shattered by a piercing scream from inside the restaurant. Harvey's heart raced as he dropped the bucket and charged back toward the building. The closer he got, the louder the screams became, each one more desperate and blood-curdling than the last. He burst through the back door, his booming voice calling out for Valerie. But just as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the restaurant like a heavy fog. Inside, the once familiar space now felt foreign and threatening. Tables and chairs cast jagged shadows under the fluorescent lights, and the smell of freshly baked pizza mingled incongruously with the metallic tang of something far darker. Harvey called out again, his voice cracking, but there was no answer. The kitchen, where Valerie had been only moments ago, was empty. His eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of her. That's when he saw it, a streak of red glistening on the floor, leading toward the front of the restaurant. Panic gripped him as he followed the trail, his footsteps heavy and hesitant, as though his body was trying to protect him from what lay ahead. Near the front counter, Valerie's lifeless body lay crumpled on the floor, her clothes stained crimson. Her once vivid presence had been replaced by a horrifying stillness. Harvey fell to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her shoulder. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, but before he could even begin to comprehend it, a shadow moved in his peripheral vision. Harvey spun around just in time to see a figure rushing toward him. He barely had time to raise his arms in defense before the attacker struck. A scuffle ensued, Harvey's raw desperation clashing against the ferocity of the assault. The older man landed a punch, but it wasn't enough. Overpowered, he stumbled back, retreating toward the rear exit. The attacker pursued relentlessly, forcing Harvey out the back door and into the cold night air. Harvey collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, but his assailant wasn't done. In a final, brutal act, they silenced him forever, leaving his body motionless in the shadow of the restaurant he had loved so dearly. The killer, now drenched in the evidence of their heinous act, returned inside. Valerie's body was still where it had fallen, but it wasn't enough for them. In a twisted need to ensure there would be no survivors, they picked up a fire extinguisher from the wall and brought it crashing down on her, over and over, until there was no doubt she would never rise again. The restaurant, once a haven of warmth and community, now stood as a silent witness to unimaginable violence. Bloodstains marred the kitchen and dining room floors, and the tools of the killer's rage, both a fire extinguisher and a mop, were eerily placed back where they belonged, as if the perpetrator believed they could erase the evidence of what had happened here. Hours later, as the town slept, a woman named Mary Fullen approached Pizza Plus to prepare for the morning shift. Unaware of the horrors that awaited her, she reached for her keys, but stopped cold when she saw Harvey's lifeless body behind the building. Panic surged through her as she rushed inside, the back door unlocked. What she found within would haunt her forever. Mary stumbled upon Valerie's body in the kitchen, her cries of anguish echoing through the empty restaurant. Somehow, she managed to dial 911, her trembling fingers fumbling over the phone. The operator instructed her to leave immediately, but the weight of what she had seen rooted her to the spot until the first officers arrived. When Police Chief David Mills stepped onto the scene, he was struck by the sheer brutality of what had unfolded. This wasn't just a crime, it was a deliberate, rage-fueled massacre. Mills, a seasoned officer in a quiet town unaccustomed to such violence, knew immediately that this case would test every resource they had. As investigators combed through the scene, piecing together the fragments of that horrific night, the community of Tazewell County was left reeling. The murders of Valerie and Harvey Looney were more than just a loss. They were a rupture in the fabric of a town that had once felt safe. The question loomed large. Who could have committed such an unthinkable act, and why? The investigation began before the blood on the restaurant floor had even dried. Chief Mills, with years of law enforcement under his belt, stood amid the chaos, trying to make sense of the carnage that had unfolded in a place he once thought of as a cornerstone of the community. The crime scene was overwhelming. Blood spattered across the kitchen walls, a fire extinguisher bearing the unmistakable signs of violence, and the cash register drawer ominously empty. Every detail seemed to scream of a robbery gone wrong, but there was something about the scene that didn't sit right with Mills. The back door of Pizza Plus had been unlocked when Mary Fullen found it earlier that morning, and even the front door had been unsecured. Yet, there were no obvious signs of forced entry. This wasn't a random smash and grab. Whoever had done this seemed to know their way around the restaurant. Mills couldn't shake the feeling that the answer might lie closer than anyone would want to believe. As local officers secured the perimeter and began their initial sweep, the Virginia State Police were called in to assist. Among them was Agent John Santola, a sharp and meticulous investigator known for his ability to connect dots that others might overlook. When he arrived on the scene, his gaze swept over the restaurant's interior, taking in the brutal efficiency of the violence. The nearly decapitated body of Valerie, the deliberate placement of the murder weapons, everything pointed to someone who had not only acted with rage, but also with a chilling level of control. Santola and Mills began their walkthrough together, examining the blood trail, the overturned furniture, and the mop and bucket positioned neatly by the back door. Santola knelt down, eyeing the faint pinkish stains on the mop head. "They cleaned up," he muttered, more to himself than to Mills. "But why? A random intruder wouldn't care about appearances." Mills nodded grimly. Whoever did this knew the layout, knew where things belonged, almost like muscle memory. Their first suspect emerged almost immediately. Brian Lee, the young employee who had been on shift with Valerie and Harvey the night before, was the last known person to see them alive. His irritation at work was no secret, and his tendency to butt heads with Valerie was well known among the staff. When officers tracked him down later that morning, Brian was groggy and visibly nervous, but he maintained that he'd left the restaurant shortly after finishing his assigned tasks. At the station, Brian sat across from Mills and Santola, his tall frame slouched in the chair. His fidgeting hands betrayed his unease, and his eyes darted around the room as though looking for an escape. "We need you to walk us through everything from last night," Santola said, his tone calm but firm. "Start from the moment you clocked in." Brian's account was straightforward. He described a busy night with customers filling the booths and officers grabbing their usual orders. He admitted to being annoyed with Valerie's insistence that he mop the floors before leaving, but he claimed he did as he was told. Afterward, he clocked out, left through the front door, and went straight home. "And the mopey?" Mills asked casually, though his eyes were sharp. "I left it by the back door," Brian replied without hesitation. That's where it always goes. The answer piqued both investigators' interest. The mop, smeared with blood, had indeed been found in its proper spot. It was a detail that suggested familiarity with the restaurant's routines. Still, Ryan's account of the night seemed rehearsed, as if he were clinging to a script. Did you notice anything unusual before you left? Santola pressed. Ryan hesitated, his gaze flickering to the table before meeting Santola's eyes. No, he said finally. Valerie was doing paperwork, and Harvey was cleaning up the kitchen. It was just a normal night. The questioning continued, but Brian stuck to his story, offering no new details. When he was finally allowed to leave, Santola turned to Mills. He is hiding something, he said, but I don't think he's our guy. Not yet, anyway. As the days wore on, investigators cast a wider net. They interviewed every current and former employee of Pizza, plus including Mary Fullen, whose observations about the local car wash added a new wrinkle to the case. The car wash, she claimed, was a hub for small-time drug activity, and one of its regulars, a man named Homer, had often visited the restaurant. Homer's demeanor had always been unsettling, and Valerie herself had reportedly found him unnerving. When officers tracked Homer down, he was sitting in his car in the parking lot of the same car wash. His expression was blank, his movements slow and deliberate. Mills and Santola approached him cautiously, their instincts on high alert. "We need to ask you about the night of the murders," Mills began. Homer's response was measured, almost too calm. He admitted to being at the Pizza Plus parking lot that night, but claimed he never went inside. Instead, he said he'd sat in his car, watching the restaurant through the window. "You just sat there?" Mills asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Homer nodded. I like watching people," he said simply. Santola leaned in, his tone sharp. "Why didn't you go inside?" Homer shrugged. "Didn't feel like it." The exchange left both investigators unnerved. Homer's detached demeanor and vague responses were unsettling, but without concrete evidence, he remained only a person of interest. Meanwhile, the forensics team worked tirelessly to process the evidence from the scene. Blood samples, fingerprints, and DNA swabs were analyzed, but the results were frustratingly inconclusive. The blood at the scene belonged only to Valerie and Harvey, and no foreign DNA could be definitively linked to the crime. With each passing day, the sense of urgency grew. Wow. The community's grief and fear were palpable, and Mills felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. This wasn't just a case. It was a battle for justice in a town that had been torn apart. But as Mills and Santola reviewed the evidence and re-examined the suspects, one thing became clear. The truth behind Valerie and Harvey Looney's murders was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The town held its breath as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no arrest in sight. The violent deaths of Valerie and Harvey left a wound in the community, a hollow ache that only deepened with time. While investigators worked tirelessly to make sense of the crime, the locals gathered at memorials, searching for comfort in shared grief. And yet, for all the sorrow and the countless condolences, one truth remained. Whoever had done this was still out there. On a drizzly autumn evening, the doors of Pizza Plus opened once more, not to serve food, but to serve as a gathering place for those who mourn. Friends, family, and townspeople filed in quietly, some clutching flowers, others lost in thought. The clinking of glasses and soft murmurs filled the air as people swapped memories of Valerie and Harvey. Their laughter, their generosity, their kindness, all echoed through the room. Chris Looney, their only son, sat at one of the booths, greeting people who offered their sympathy. He kept his gaze down, his expression unreadable, as if the weight of his loss was too much to bear. In a small town like this, police officers often become a part of the extended family, and that night, many of them joined the community's tribute. Officers who had once shared slices of pizza with Valerie and Harvey now stood solemnly by, their uniforms a stark reminder of the tragedy. Chief Mills and Agent Santola watched from the back of the room, exchanging silent glances. They weren't here to look for suspects, they were here to honor their friends. And yet, in a crime as shocking as this, every person was a potential clue. In the days that followed, the investigation resumed with renewed vigor. Chief Mills, a man who had always prided himself on his intuition, was haunted by the details of the case. He went over the scene in his mind time and again, focusing on the placement of the mop and fire extinguisher, the absence of forced entry, and the calculated nature of the attack. These weren't the actions of a random intruder. They were deliberate, methodical, the kind of actions that suggested a deeper, personal connection. Santola, too, was feeling the strain. In his years of experience, he had encountered cases that defied logic, but this one gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. Every lead felt like a dead end. Every suspect left him unconvinced. Brian Lee, Homer, even the townspeople who seemed innocuous, none seemed capable of the brutality they'd witnessed. And then there was Chris, the grieving son. He had answered every question, offered every alibi, but there was something about his demeanor that lingered in Santola's mind, something that didn't quite add up. As the investigation stretched into winter, the Virginia State Police assigned Santola to another case, pulling him away from Tazewell County. With his departure, the case fell back onto the shoulders of Chief Mills. Alone, Mills was left to shoulder the weight of the town's grief and expectations, and the pressure of finding justice for his friends. Night after sleepless night, he pored over the evidence, wrestling with the knowledge that every unanswered question kept a killer on the streets. Time moved on, but the case remained frozen, haunting the people of Tazewell County like a bad dream. Eventually, the investigation went cold, the unanswered questions fading into the background of everyday life. Mills, worn down by the weight of it all, retired, carrying the unsolved case with him like a scar. But the memory of Valerie and Harvey stayed fresh in the minds of those who knew them, a wound that never quite healed. Years passed, and with them came new leadership. A fresh face at the police department, determined to make a difference, took up the mantle. The new police chief made a decision that would change the course of the investigation and perhaps finally bring justice to a family and community that had waited so long. Years after the horrific deaths of Valerie and Harvey Looney, the cold case resurfaced in Tazewell County with a renewed intensity. The town's new police chief, intent on solving the unsolved murder that had scarred the community, sought help from a seasoned interrogator, Rich Byington, a specialist known for his mastery of the Reed technique, a method that used a mix of psychological pressure and sympathy to draw out the truth. Byington's arrival at the Tazewell County Sheriff's Department marked a shift in the case's direction. A man of unassuming appearance, he was renowned for his patience and precision in breaking down suspects over extended hours of questioning. The new sheriff briefed him on every detail, revisiting old suspects' motives and the forensic evidence that had once felt so conclusive, yet led nowhere. Byington knew that for this case, with its layers of personal ties and brutal violence, it was essential to look beyond the surface. The team assembled a list of people to be re-interviewed, focusing primarily on Brian Lee, Homer, and Chris Looney. With Chris at the top of his list, Byington reviewed everything related to family history, financial records, relationships, and any potential motives that had been previously overlooked. One fact stood out. Chris was the sole beneficiary of his parents' life insurance policy, totaling a substantial sum. This motive, combined with subtle inconsistencies in his past statements, gave Byington a starting point. The interrogation room was dimly lit and sparse, designed to wear down anyone inside it. Chris sat across from Byington, who started with a tone that was calm, even sympathetic. Over the course of hours, Byington asked Chris about his memories of his parents, his feelings about their passing, and how he had coped with their absence. Chris seemed tense but composed, answering in measured tones as though he had rehearsed this many times before. Shifting the conversation, Byington started probing into Chris' life following the murders, his financial struggles, his divorce, and the ways he had tried to restart his life. "It couldn't have been easy moving back in with your parents after the separation," Byington said, watching Chris' reaction carefully. Chris shrugged, his gaze distant. "It wasn't ideal, but they were there for me." "And how did they feel about helping you?" Byington continued, his tone both gentle and pressing. "Did they support you, or did they ever make it clear that they had limits?" Chris shifted in his seat, his expression tightening. "They were fine with it. We were family." Byington leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Chris. "Did that ever change? Did they ever tell you they couldn't keep helping?" Chris hesitated, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face. "Maybe a few times, but it was never serious." But Byington sensed he was touching on a sore point, a resentment that had perhaps festered over time. He let the silence stretch, letting Chris feel the weight of his own words. "It must have been hard, though," Byington said softly, "to feel dependent, to feel cornered." Chris' jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The conversation shifted back and forth, with Byington skillfully mixing empathy with pressure. He started mentioning specific dates, times, and the night of the murder, asking Chris to recount his whereabouts. Each time Chris answered, Byington subtly adjusted his questions, throwing in small, conflicting details to see if Chris' story would shift. And gradually, the carefully constructed version of events Chris had clung to for years began to waver. After hours of subtle probing, Byington leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chris, I know this has been difficult for you. I know that night didn't go the way you planned. Maybe you didn't even mean for it to happen this way, but sometimes, when we're pushed to our limits, we do things we can take back." Chris' composure faltered, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. Byington maintained the pressure, combining understanding with the relentless suggestion that Chris had been pushed too far, that he'd felt trapped and desperate. In that moment of vulnerability, Chris' defenses cracked. His breathing grew shallow, and he finally broke down. With tears in his eyes, he confessed to the horrific truth he had hidden for years. He spoke of how he had felt trapped and humiliated after his divorce, resentful of his parents' financial control. The life insurance policy had become a dark solution to his problems, a way out he had entertained until it became a reality. According to Chris' confession, the argument that night had started over money. Valerie had refused his request, insisting he needed to find his own path forward. In a fit of anger, Chris had snapped, losing control in a way he never could have imagined. He described attacking her, the rush of emotion blinding him to the horror of his actions. When Harvey tried to intervene, Chris' rage found another target, leading to the brutal end they both suffered. By the time Chris finished his confession, his voice had become hollow, as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. He admitted to everything, including the disturbing details, returning the mop and fire extinguisher to their places to stage a semblance of normalcy, taking the cash from the register to make it look like a robbery. He had even gone to work the next day, feigning shock and grief when the news reached him. Byington's expression remained neutral, the gravity of the confession weighing heavily in the room. The truth of what had happened in Pizza Plus that night was finally clear. The unimaginable betrayal, the cold calculation, and the violence born of desperation had come to light. The confession from Chris Looney shook the investigators to their core, but it was also the breakthrough they needed to finally bring closure to the case. With his admission on record, the wheels of justice turned swiftly. As word spread of Chris' involvement, shock and disbelief rippled through Tazewell County. This was a town that had lost two beloved members in a crime so brutal that no one had thought it could have been committed by one of their own, let alone their son. Following his confession, Chris' arrest and the subsequent charges were formalized quickly. Prosecutors prepared to make a case that would leave no room for doubt. They highlighted Chris' motive, driven by financial desperation and his resentment over being forced to rely on his parents after his divorce. The life insurance policy, they argued, had been a dark temptation, an opportunity Chris had seized in a moment of rage. In the courtroom, Chris appeared detached, his once stoic demeanor now a hollow mask. Family members of Valerie and Harvey sat in silent agony, some unable to look at him, others fixated on the person who had so drastically betrayed his parents' trust. Friends and neighbors filled the courtroom as well, their faces etched with a mix of sorrow and anger. This was not just a trial, it was a reckoning for the entire community. The prosecution's case was straightforward, built around Chris' confession and the mountain of circumstantial evidence that painted him as the only plausible suspect. They recounted how he'd planned the murders down to the last detail, including his attempt to stage the scene as a robbery by taking the cash from the register. They showed the jury photos of the carefully placed mop and fire extinguisher, both bearing traces of Valerie's blood. These items, they argued, revealed not only Chris' familiarity with the restaurant, but his cold effort to clean up after his crime, almost as if he'd hoped to erase what he'd done. Chris' defense attorneys, faced with his explicit confession, had little ground to stand on. They attempted to argue that the crime had been a momentary lapse in judgment, that Chris hadn't planned to harm his parents, and that his actions had spiraled out of control in the heat of the moment. But the prosecution dismantled this argument, pointing to the sequence of events and the brutal manner of Valerie and Harvey's deaths as evidence of a calculated plan rather than a crime of passion. As the trial progressed, chilling details from Chris' confession emerged. The jury learned of how he had left the restaurant that night as if nothing had happened, returning home to feign ignorance until the news of his parents' deaths spread the following morning. He described his actions in a detached manner that left many in the courtroom stunned. Chris' lack of remorse, his cold retelling of the events, seemed to drive home the truth of what had happened, and it weighed heavily on everyone present. In the final days of the trial, the prosecution brought forward family members who shared memories of Valerie and Harvey's kindness, generosity, and love for their son. They spoke of the impact the couple had on the community, painting a picture of two people who had given so much and asked for so little in return. The tragedy of their deaths was not just in the violent way they had been taken, but in the betrayal of trust from someone they had raised and cherished. Finally, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed, each minute heavy with anticipation, until they returned with a verdict, guilty on all charges. Chris Looney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the community, the verdict was a relief, but it could not erase the painful reality of what had transpired. After the trial, the Looney family issued a statement expressing the complexity of their grief. They mourned not only Valerie and Harvey, but also the loss of the son they thought they knew. Their words were a mix of love and sorrow, capturing the fractured emotions that only a tragedy of this magnitude could evoke. As Chris was led from the courtroom, he glanced back, his expression unreadable. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, his life a shadow of what it could have been, consumed by the consequences of his actions. For Tazewell County, the case was closed, but the echoes of Valerie and Harvey's lives lingered in the community. They were remembered not as victims, but as pillars of warmth and kindness, forever honored in the memories of those who knew them. The Looney case became a somber lesson on the fragility of trust and the darkness that can sometimes lie hidden within those we think we know best. And though the town would eventually heal, the memory of Valerie and Harvey Looney and the terrible betrayal that ended their lives would never be forgotten. The next story is called The Military Mystery. In the oppressive heat of a summer night in Iraq, the quiet hum of activity in the U.S. military base seemed routine, almost mundane. Soldiers moved about with purpose, their boots crunching against the dirt. But behind one of the nondescript tents, a grim discovery would shatter the facade of normalcy and raise questions that no one seemed ready to answer. The lifeless body of Private First Class Lavena Johnson was found inside a communications tent. The 19-year-old soldier, known for her bright smile and resolute determination, had her life tragically cut short in circumstances that defied explanation. At first glance, the scene suggested she had succumbed to a moment of despair, an assumption the military was quick to present. But even in those early hours, inconsistencies hung in the air like a dark cloud. The tent, now a scene of tragedy, was eerily quiet except for the murmur of voices from the responding personnel. Inside, there were scattered signs of a struggle, subtle but undeniable. A rifle lay at her side, an element that would become a focal point in the official narrative. Yet, to those who knew Lavena, the idea of her taking her own life was as unrecognizable as the blood-streaked floor beneath her. Word of Lavena's death reached her family, back in Missouri, as they were settling into what should have been an ordinary evening. When the knock came at the door, it felt like a thunderclap in the night. Dr. John Johnson, a retired military veteran, opened the door to see two uniformed officers standing solemnly on his porch. Their expressions said it all before they even uttered the words that would forever change the trajectory of his life. "She's gone," they said. "Your daughter? She's gone." The explanation came quickly, too quickly. A gunshot wound. A supposed act of despair. The details were sparse and carefully chosen, delivered with a practiced monotone meant to mitigate the pain, but instead, leaving an empty, aching void. Lavena's parents, stunned and disoriented, could only grasp at the fragments of what they were being told. But beneath their shock lay a simmering disbelief, a gnawing instinct that something was wrong. The days following Lavena's death were a blur of grief and formalities. Her body was flown home under the solemn care of the military, accompanied by a flag that seemed to mock the unanswered questions swirling around her death. Her family gathered for the funeral, their heartbreak shared by friends and neighbors who had watched Lavena grow into the remarkable young woman she was. Yet, even as they mourned, unease began to take root. Dr. Johnson, a man who had spent years serving his country, knew how these things were supposed to go. The clean, precise lines of military protocol were etched into his memory. But as he began to process the details surrounding his daughter's death, those lines blurred into contradictions. The first clue came when the family prepared to view Lavena's body. Her face bore marks, bruises, a broken nose that were inconsistent with the official account. These were not the signs of a simple tragedy. They told a story of violence, one that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. The family's questions grew louder, but the answers remained infuriatingly vague. The military stood by its initial conclusion, citing evidence that Lavena had taken her own life. They pointed to the rifle found at the scene and a single gunshot wound as proof. But the Johnsons weren't convinced. Their daughter's cheerful letters, filled with plans for the future and reassurances of her safety, painted a picture of hope, not despair. Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Johnson requested the case, files, and photographs. What he found only deepened his suspicions. Autopsy photos revealed burns on Lavena's hands, as though someone had tried to destroy evidence. There were indications of physical trauma, broken bones, and a damaged jaw that suggested a violent altercation. Most chilling of all, the bullet wound, which the military claimed was self-inflicted, didn't align with the weapon found at the scene. The angle was wrong, the evidence too neatly packaged. As he pieced together the fragments of the story, Dr. Johnson's disbelief turned to outrage. He reached out to anyone who would listen: journalists, activists, and lawmakers. Slowly, the story of Lavena Johnson began to reach beyond the confines of her family's grief, igniting a firestorm of questions about accountability and truth. Why had the scene been so hastily categorized? Why did the evidence point to something far more sinister than the official narrative suggested? And most importantly, who was responsible for the horrors Lavena had endured in her final moments? The Johnson family's quest for answers became a battle against a wall of silence. As they delved deeper, their findings painted a picture not just of a single tragedy, but of a system that seemed intent on protecting itself at all costs. Whispers of a cover-up began to circulate, fueled by the inconsistencies and the military's refusal to reopen the case. Each revelation was a dagger, cutting deeper into the already raw wounds of their loss. Back at the base in Iraq, where Lavena had spent her final days, her fellow soldiers grappled with their own questions. Some hinted at tensions and misconduct within the unit, while others claimed to have seen nothing out of the ordinary. The tent where Lavena had been found was scrubbed clean, the traces of that night erased, leaving only the Johnsons to fight for a truth that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Dr. Johnson refused to let his daughter's story fade into the shadows. He pored over autopsy reports and forensic evidence, his once steady hands trembling with rage and sorrow. Lavena's mother, Linda, stood beside him, her quiet strength a beacon in the storm. Together, they resolved to honor their daughter not just in memory, but in action, determined to uncover the truth and demand justice. What happened to Lavena Johnson in that tent on that sweltering night in Iraq remains a haunting question. The answers, obscured by bureaucracy and secrecy, continue to elude her family and those who have joined their fight. But one thing is certain. The story of Lavena Johnson is not one of despair, but of a relentless pursuit of truth in the face of unimaginable loss. Her voice, silenced in life, has become a rallying cry for those who refuse to accept injustice. The military's official explanation for Lavena Johnson's death began circulating within days, a tragic loss attributed to despair. Yet, the Johnson family found themselves wrestling with a conclusion that felt hastily constructed and deeply flawed. Dr. Johnson, with years of experience in the military himself, was all too familiar with the precision and thoroughness demanded in such investigations. But the case presented to him lacked clarity, raising more questions than it answered. The report stated that Lavena had taken her own life, a theory supported, according to officials, by the presence of her service weapon at the scene. Yet, even the cursory information given to the family seemed riddled with inconsistencies. The positioning of her body, the nature of her injuries, and the alleged method all defied logic. These were not just suspicions, they were glaring contradictions that needed resolution. As Dr. Johnson pored over the details, a chilling realization began to take shape. If the official story was true, why did the evidence tell a different tale? There were signs of injuries inconsistent with a single gunshot wound. Bruising on her body suggested a struggle. The burns on her hands, revealed during a second examination, hinted at a deliberate attempt to erase evidence. These were not the hallmarks of self-inflicted harm. They pointed to something far darker. Despite the Johnson family's rising doubts, their efforts to obtain a full account of the investigation were met with silence or carefully measured responses. The military maintained its stance, emphasizing the sensitivity of the case and the confidentiality of certain details. For the Johnsons, this silence only deepened their suspicions. What was being hidden, and why? Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Johnson enlisted the help of independent experts. Forensic pathologists and investigators began combing through the available evidence, piecing together a timeline that starkly contrasted the military's narrative. They noted blunt force trauma that had not been adequately explained. The bullet wound, initially cited as the cause of death, did not align with the rifle found at the scene. Its trajectory suggested an angle inconsistent with the weapon's placement, a discrepancy that should have been impossible to overlook. Adding to the growing mountain of questions was the absence of critical evidence. Surveillance footage, which could have provided key insights into Lavena's final hours, was conveniently missing. Witness statements, if taken, were either not included in the report or had been redacted to the point of uselessness. Every avenue the Johnsons pursued seemed to end in a roadblock, yet each closed door only strengthened their resolve. Dr. Johnson began speaking out publicly, a measured but impassioned voice in the face of growing scrutiny. He reached out to media outlets, hoping that public exposure would force a reopening of the case. The story gained traction, drawing attention from advocacy groups and lawmakers. Whispers of other similar cases began to surface. Stories of service members whose deaths had been ruled as self-inflicted under suspicious circumstances. Among the voices joining the Johnsons' fight were those of veterans and former military personnel who believed their suspicions were justified. They pointed to systemic issues, a culture of silence where inconvenient truths were buried to protect reputations. Lavena's case, they argued, was emblematic of a larger problem, one that demanded accountability. Meanwhile, the Johnsons worked tirelessly to piece together a more complete picture of what had transpired. They turned to private investigators, who began connecting dots the original investigation had overlooked or dismissed. One chilling detail that emerged was a series of reported altercations involving Lavena in the days leading up to her death. Witnesses described heated arguments between her and unidentified individuals, though the specifics of these confrontations remained elusive. The most startling revelations came from the forensic evidence itself. Private specialists who examined Lavena's body uncovered signs of violence that had been conspicuously absent from the official autopsy report. Her broken nose, the bruising around her neck, and evidence of possible restraint painted a picture of a physical altercation. These injuries were not consistent with the military's explanation, but pointed instead to a deliberate act of harm inflicted by another. Then there were the burns, small but significant marks on her hands. Experts suggested these could have been the result of a hurried attempt to destroy evidence, perhaps to obscure DNA or other incriminating traces. It was a hypothesis that added a chilling dimension to the case. Someone had not only harmed Lavena, but had gone to great lengths to ensure the truth of her final moments would remain obscured. As the Johnsons continued their fight, they faced resistance not just from military officials, but from a culture that seemed intent on preserving its image at all costs. To question the official account was to challenge a powerful institution, and that came with consequences. Yet, Lavena's family remained undeterred. Their quest was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It had become a battle for justice, not only for their daughter but for every service member whose story had been buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy. The military's refusal to reopen the investigation only fueled public outrage. Protests began to form, with supporters demanding transparency and accountability. Lavena's name became a rallying cry for those who believed in the pursuit of truth, no matter the cost. Her story, once confined to the shadows, began to shine a light on systemic failures and the lengths to which institutions would go to protect their own. The Johnsons knew their battle was far from over. The closer they came to uncovering the truth, the more resistance they faced. Yet, with each new revelation, the cracks in the official story grew wider, exposing the fragile foundation on which it had been built. Lavena's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was a catalyst for change, a stark reminder of the price of silence. Her family's fight continued, their voices unwavering as they pressed forward, determined to ensure that Lavena's story would not be forgotten. Dr. John Johnson sat in his quiet home office, the walls lined with photos of Lavena and her siblings. The evidence files, scattered across his desk, were a stark contrast to the warm memories captured in those pictures. He leaned forward, meticulously comparing documents, autopsy photos, and handwritten notes. The questions surrounding his daughter's death were no longer whispers in his mind. They were deafening, demanding answers. The autopsy report had been a pivotal moment in the family's investigation. Dr. Johnson had noticed discrepancies immediately, details that the military's explanation failed to address. The official cause of death did not align with the physical evidence, and the injuries Lavena sustained were too extensive to be dismissed as self-inflicted. There was bruising around her neck, indicative of possible strangulation. The gunshot wound, while prominently featured in the report, had irregularities that raised more doubts. Its angle was inconsistent with the mechanics of how the weapon could have been used, and no gunpowder residue was found on her hands, a detail that contradicted the standard expectation in such cases. Driven by both grief and determination, Dr. Johnson reached out to independent forensic experts. These professionals, unbound by the restrictions of military protocol, conducted a thorough analysis of the materials provided. Their findings were damning. In addition to the broken nose and signs of physical trauma, the burn marks on Lavena's hands became a focal point. Experts theorized these burns could have been caused by a chemical agent or a deliberate attempt to obscure evidence. The implications were horrifying. Meanwhile, Linda Johnson, Lavena's mother, had taken on her own role in the investigation. She combed through letters and emails from her daughter, searching for any indication of distress. What she found instead were messages full of hope and plans for the future. Lavena had spoken of returning home, of her pride in serving, and her excitement for what lay ahead. There were no signs of despair, no cryptic warnings of what was to come. These messages only deepened the family's conviction that the truth of her death had been deliberately buried. As public interest in Lavena's case grew, so did the pressure on officials to address the inconsistencies. Advocacy groups began to rally around the Johnson family, using Lavena's story as a call to action for broader accountability within the military. Whistleblowers started to emerge, some anonymously sharing insights into a culture of silence and fear. These individuals painted a troubling picture of power dynamics and systemic failures that allowed such tragedies to be swept under the rug. Among the most shocking revelations was the possibility that Lavena's death was connected to an act of violence by another individual. Whispers of misconduct and predatory behavior within certain units hinted at a darker undercurrent within the base's operations. Fellow soldiers, speaking under the protection of anonymity, described an environment where young women often felt unsafe, where complaints were ignored or dismissed, and where silence was often the only means of survival. Dr. Johnson refused to let these revelations remain in the shadows. He contacted journalists and advocacy groups, providing them with the evidence he had painstakingly compiled. News outlets began to pick up the story, framing it as a case of potential foul play that had been overlooked, if not actively covered up. The pressure mounted, forcing officials to defend their position publicly. Yet, even as scrutiny increased, the military remained resolute in its original conclusion, citing a lack of conclusive evidence to support reopening the case. In the background, the Johnson family's legal team worked tirelessly to obtain additional documentation. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests, seeking access to files and communications that might shed light on the investigation. Each delay, each redacted document felt like another hurdle designed to wear them down. But the Johnsons pressed on, their resolve unshaken. One of the most critical pieces of evidence to emerge during this time was an analysis of the crime scene photographs. Independent experts pointed out signs of a possible struggle, overturned objects, unexplained blood patterns, and the positioning of Lavena's body. These details told a story that starkly contrasted the military's claims. The tent itself, hastily cleaned and sanitized before investigators could conduct a thorough examination, was a glaring red flag. What had been erased and why? The Johnsons also learned of previous cases with haunting similarities to Lavena's. Families of other service members began reaching out, sharing stories of their own loved ones whose deaths had been labeled as self-inflicted under questionable circumstances. Patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested these were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger issue within the system. The more the Johnsons uncovered, the more the weight of their mission grew. They were not just fighting for Lavena's legacy, they were fighting for systemic change, for accountability, and for justice for all those who had been silenced. Dr. Johnson in particular found himself consumed by this fight. His days were spent analyzing evidence, meeting with advocates, and giving interviews to anyone willing to amplify their story. Each revelation brought them closer to the truth, but also exposed the enormity of the forces they were up against. As days turned into months, the Johnson family found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Lavena's name became a symbol, a rallying cry for those demanding answers. Yet, for all their progress, the question remained: would the truth ever fully come to light? As the Johnson family continued their relentless search for answers, a pattern of resistance became increasingly apparent. Despite mounting evidence and growing public support, the military maintained its original conclusion, refusing to entertain the possibility of re-examining Lavena Johnson's case. Behind closed doors, whispers of bureaucratic obfuscation and institutional priorities began to reach the family. But even as the barriers rose higher, so did their determination. Dr. Johnson's meticulous research revealed troubling details about the culture within the base where Lavena had served. Accounts from former service members painted a picture of an environment rife with underlying tensions. Women, in particular, often spoke of harassment and the pervasive fear of speaking out. Some hinted at the presence of a shadow culture, where incidents of violence or misconduct were either downplayed or outright ignored to protect the image of the institution. These revelations struck a nerve, deepening the Johnson family's conviction that Lavena's death was not the result of despair, but something far more sinister. One chilling detail came from a fellow soldier who had served alongside Lavena. Speaking under anonymity, they described seeing Lavena engaged in an argument just days before her death. The details of the confrontation were vague, but the witness remembered Lavena standing her ground, her voice resolute despite the tension. This testimony, though unverified, suggested a potential motive or at least a lead worth pursuing. Yet it was a lead that seemed absent from the official investigation. The Johnson family's efforts to uncover the truth began attracting allies in unexpected places. Advocacy groups, journalists, and even lawmakers started to rally around the case, pushing for transparency and accountability. Public pressure mounted, driven by a growing awareness of other cases where service members' deaths had been similarly dismissed as acts of despair under questionable circumstances. Lavena's story became emblematic of a larger issue, a tragic symbol of lives cut short and stories left untold. As the spotlight intensified, so did the scrutiny of the original investigation. Independent forensic experts continued to examine the evidence, identifying troubling inconsistencies that further undermined the military's narrative. The burn marks on Lavena's hands, for instance, were now being analyzed through a broader lens. Specialists suggested they could have resulted from an attempt to remove evidence, such as DNA or fingerprints, an act that pointed unmistakably to foul play. Similarly, the absence of gunpowder residue on Lavena's hands contradicted the very foundation of the official explanation. These findings, presented in stark detail, only added weight to the growing demands for accountability. Meanwhile, Linda Johnson turned her attention to the broader fight for justice. While Dr. Johnson delved deeper into the specifics of Lavena's case, Linda reached out to other families who had faced similar tragedies. Together, they formed a network of voices, united by grief but empowered by a shared goal: to shine a light on the systemic failures that allowed these tragedies to remain hidden. Their collective stories painted a harrowing picture of a system that often prioritized self-preservation over truth. The media began to take notice, with major outlets covering Lavena's story and the broader implications of her case. Documentaries, articles, and social media campaigns brought her name into public consciousness, sparking debates about the treatment of service members and the culture of silence that seemed to pervade certain institutions. Advocacy groups organized marches and vigils, their chants echoing a single demand: justice for Laverna Johnson. Amid this rising tide of public awareness, new evidence came to light. A former investigator who had worked briefly on Laverna's case before being reassigned stepped forward with a startling revelation. According to their account, certain pieces of evidence had been omitted from the official report, including witness statements and forensic details that could have pointed to foul play. Though they could not provide the missing documents, their testimony added another layer of doubt to the military's explanation. The Johnson family, armed with this new information, pressed forward with renewed vigor. They filed additional legal requests, seeking access to records that had been withheld or heavily redacted. Each document they received, though frustratingly incomplete, added another piece to the puzzle. Patterns began to emerge, patterns of negligence, oversight, and potentially deliberate concealment. As the case gained traction, lawmakers began to weigh in, calling for independent reviews of Laverna's case and others like it. Congressional hearings were proposed, aiming to investigate the broader issue of service member safety and the accountability of military investigations. For the Johnson family, this was a bittersweet milestone. It marked progress in their fight, but also underscored the lengths they had to go to for basic acknowledgement of their daughter's death. Despite these advancements, the Johnsons knew their fight was far from over. Each victory was met with new challenges, each revelation with new questions. Yet through it all, their resolve never wavered. They had started this journey as grieving parents seeking answers for their daughter. Now, they found themselves at the forefront of a movement, their voices joined by countless others demanding change. The truth, elusive as it seemed, felt closer with every step they took. In the years since Laverna Johnson's death, her name had become synonymous with resilience and the fight for justice. Public pressure was now an undeniable force, with advocacy groups and lawmakers amplifying the call for transparency. Yet, for Dr. Johnson and his family, the battle was deeply personal, a relentless pursuit of answers for a daughter they refused to let be forgotten. The turning point came with the involvement of an investigative journalist who had been following the case for years. They uncovered previously unreported details, including the testimonies of former soldiers who spoke of an incident on the base shortly before Laverna's death. These accounts, though fragmented, hinted at tension between Laverna and several individuals, adding a new layer to the mystery. One soldier described overhearing an argument, her voice calm but firm as she seemed to challenge someone in authority. This, coupled with other hints of interpersonal conflict, painted a picture of a young woman unwilling to back down, a trait that may have made her a target. With this information in hand, the Johnson family's legal team filed additional requests for access to withheld evidence. The pressure from both public opinion and lawmakers became too great to ignore, forcing the military to release select documents previously marked confidential. While heavily redacted, these records revealed a chilling detail, an internal memo acknowledging discrepancies in the initial investigation. Though the memo lacked specifics, it was a tacit admission that the case had not been as clear-cut as originally claimed. Dr. Johnson pored over these documents late into the night, his determination unwavering despite the emotional toll. Each redacted line felt like an insult to his daughter's memory, a barrier between him and the truth. Linda Johnson, ever his steady partner, worked tirelessly alongside him, coordinating with activists and rallying support for legislative action. Together, they were a force, united by love for their daughter and a shared mission to hold those responsible accountable. The public outcry reached a crescendo when a whistleblower came forward with critical information. This individual, who had been part of the initial investigative team, confirmed suspicions of foul play. They described irregularities at the crime scene, including evidence that had been tampered with or removed altogether. Their testimony also shed light on the rushed nature of the initial inquiry, with pressure from higher-ups to close the case quickly. These revelations sent shockwaves through the public, reigniting calls for an independent investigation. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued their work, using advanced techniques to re-examine the existing evidence. The burn marks on Laverna's hands, previously attributed to an accident, were now believed to be deliberate attempts to destroy key traces. DNA analysis, though limited by the condition of the samples, hinted at the presence of multiple individuals at the scene, an explosive finding that contradicted the lone actor theory implied by the military's narrative. As these findings came to light, lawmakers took decisive action, calling for congressional hearings to address Lavina's case and others like it. Dr. Johnson was invited to testify, his voice shaking with emotion as he recounted his family's journey. He spoke not only of his daughter's bright spirit, but also of the systemic failures that had compounded their grief. His words resonated deeply, sparking bipartisan support for broader reforms. In the months that followed, an independent task force was convened to review Lavina's case, comprising forensic specialists, legal experts, and former military officials. The team worked diligently to piece together the truth. Their preliminary findings, though not yet conclusive, pointed to glaring errors in the original investigation, from the mishandling of evidence to the dismissal of crucial testimonies. For the Johnson family, this progress was bittersweet. While they welcomed the renewed attention and accountability, it could not erase the pain of their loss. Yet, in Lavina's memory, they found strength. Linda often spoke at public events, her voice steady as she urged others to join the fight for justice. Dr. Johnson continued his meticulous research, driven by a belief that the truth was within reach. The task force's final report, when it was released, confirmed what the Johnsons had long suspected. Lavina's death could not be definitively explained by the official narrative. The report highlighted critical gaps in the investigation and called for a comprehensive review of similar cases. While it stopped short of naming those responsible, it laid the groundwork for accountability and change. Public reaction was swift, with renewed calls for justice not just for Lavina, but for all service members whose stories had been similarly dismissed. Advocacy groups, empowered by this milestone, pushed for systemic reforms to ensure transparency and accountability in military investigations. Lavina's name became a rallying cry, a symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. For the Johnson family, the fight was far from over, but they took solace in the progress made. Lavina's legacy, forged through their tireless efforts, was one of hope and determination. Her story had sparked a movement, a ripple effect of change that would continue to grow. And while the scars of their loss would never fully heal, the Johnsons knew they had honored their daughter in the best way they could, by ensuring her voice was heard, her life remembered, and her truth pursued. The next and final story is called A Tragic Loss in the Military. It was early on a brisk December morning when Corporal Maria Lauterbach's disappearance came to light. The winter chill had just started to settle into the city of Jacksonville, North Carolina. Shadows from bare trees stretched across the landscape, casting an eerie stillness that seemed to echo the silence inside her small, vacant apartment. Her mother, Mary Lauterbach, hadn't heard from Maria in days, and as each hour passed, her concern escalated. Maria was not the type to disappear without a word, especially not now, when she was several months pregnant. Driven by instinct and an increasing dread, Mary dialed the authorities, voicing her fears. It was unusual, she said, for Maria to go so long without contact. The military police at Camp Lejeune, where Maria served as a Marine, began an immediate investigation, making inquiries with her fellow Marines and neighbors, but no one had any answer. The only lead was an ominous piece of information Maria had shared months prior. She'd filed a report claiming harassment and even assault by a superior, a fellow Marine named Caesar Lorien. And now Maria was gone. The investigation unfolded with urgency, and it wasn't long before the focus of the investigation shifted towards Lorien, whose evasive responses only heightened suspicions. When questioned, he claimed he had nothing to do with Maria's disappearance. He alleged she was unstable, a remark that many found unsettling. But Lorien's dismissiveness seemed almost too calculated, and as investigators continued their work, every word he spoke raised more questions than answers. The search for Maria intensified, and soon, the city was plastered with missing person flyers, Maria's face staring back at people from every street corner, every bulletin board. The grimness of the situation weighed heavily on the tight-knit military community. As the days turned to weeks, hope dwindled, and whispers began to circulate that perhaps something far darker had happened. It was then that a tip from a concerned neighbor led investigators to a small, unassuming patch of land behind Lorien's home. Shovels in hand, the officers dug through the frozen ground, their breaths visible in the biting air. What they uncovered was a shallow grave, and beneath the soil lay the remains of a young woman, concealed in layers of earth. With a sinking heart, the lead investigator ordered that the area be sealed off, the gravity of the discovery clear in his expression. The media descended on the scene, cameras capturing the site, and the word spread rapidly. They had found Maria. As news of Maria Lauterbach's discovery spread, the town of Jacksonville was gripped by disbelief. How could this have happened to a young Marine, someone who had dedicated herself to serving her country? Questions swirled, and every headline seemed to pull the town deeper into the grim details of her case. Among the ranks at Camp Lejeune, the shock was even more personal. Fellow Marines felt the loss profoundly, wondering how one of their own could vanish so tragically and under such troubling circumstances. The investigators knew that the path forward was complex. With Maria's report of harassment against Corporal Cesar Lorien, he became the center of their focus. Lorien's military record showed a man with strong performance reviews and a seemingly unblemished service record. But to those piecing together Maria's final days, this polished image felt like a veneer. The more they learned, the more it became apparent that Lorien had hidden layers, ones that might conceal a much darker reality. Investigators began tracing Lorien's movements leading up to and after Maria's disappearance. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and records of his daily activity were analyzed with painstaking detail. His house became the focal point of their search. Behind its ordinary walls, officers pored over every inch, looking for anything that might connect Lorien to Maria's last known whereabouts. What they found only intensified their suspicions. In the garage, investigators came across traces of blood spatter that forensic analysis later confirmed to match Maria's DNA. Nearby, they discovered a scorched section of the floor, a chilling sign of an attempt to destroy evidence. The smell of charred wood lingered faintly in the air, suggesting that someone had tried to cover up the crime. A sense of unease settled over the scene, the emptiness of the space punctuated by the investigators' silent realization that something irreversible had happened here. As they moved from room to room, another piece of evidence emerged, a hastily written note, crumpled and left in a drawer. In it, Lorien seemed to imply Maria had taken her own life, portraying himself as an innocent bystander in her last moments. Yet, the clinical language and cold indifference that marked his words didn't match the evidence that lay before them. To the investigators, it was clear that this note was an attempt to mislead, one that only served to deepen their conviction that Lorien had far more to hide than he'd admit. With mounting evidence, authorities issued an arrest warrant. But by the time they arrived to take Lorien into custody, he had vanished. He'd left behind his uniform, his military ID, and his phone. Investigators were left with a single grim possibility: he had fled. The search was now a race against time, as every passing moment allowed him to slip further from their grasp. The investigation spread across state lines, and soon, alerts were sent throughout the country and beyond. Tips flooded in, some claiming sightings from distant towns, others with theories about Lorien's possible whereabouts. But none led to him, and his absence hung over the case like a heavy shadow. Even as the search continued, those who had known Maria, her friends, family, and fellow Marines, were left to wrestle with the tragedy. As the manhunt for Cesar Lorien intensified, investigators turned their focus to understanding how he might have escaped and where he could be hiding. Lorien's abrupt disappearance had rattled both military and civilian authorities. They knew that if he was to be captured, they had to act fast. His sudden flight pointed to a well-thought-out plan, and they feared he could disappear for good if he crossed the border. News of his escape put the town and the military community on edge, as Jacksonville faced the sobering reality that a wanted man was out there, evading justice. With each passing day, speculation grew. Rumors circulated about how far he might go and the lengths he would take to evade capture. For those closest to Maria, this was a bitter reminder of the unanswered questions surrounding her death, questions that would only find resolution with Lorien in custody. Determined to close in on him, authorities tracked every possible lead, from potential sightings to credit card records. They scrutinized every friend, family member, and acquaintance Lorien might contact, hoping one connection might betray his location. But for days, their efforts yielded nothing. It became clear that Lorien had thought this escape through carefully, exploiting every opportunity to remain concealed. Then, an unexpected break came. Investigators discovered a pattern in the reports. Multiple sightings indicated that Lorien was heading toward Mexico. With this realization, authorities focused their search southward. The U.S. Marshals and Mexican authorities coordinated a joint effort, increasing patrols along border areas and sharing intelligence in the hopes of narrowing down his location. In the meantime, the Lauterbach family faced the agonizing wait for justice. For Mary Lauterbach, the pain of losing her daughter was compounded by the uncertainty of Lorien's whereabouts. Friends and family members rallied around her, offering support, but the strain of Mariah's absence weighed heavily on everyone. Each day that Lorien remained free was a reminder of the life he had taken and the justice still out of reach. Just as the case seemed to go cold, reports surfaced that Lorien had been sighted deep in Mexico. Working with Mexican law enforcement, U.S. authorities expanded their search, knowing that with the right timing, they could bring him back to face the consequences of his actions. The lead on Lorien's possible location in Mexico brought a renewed sense of urgency to the case. Working closely with Mexican authorities, U.S. investigators were on high alert. Months of searching had led to this critical moment. Lorien had managed to evade capture, but he was still vulnerable, hiding in a foreign country without the resources or allies he had relied on back home. As joint task forces mobilized, they coordinated meticulously, closing in on locations where they suspected he might be hiding. The Mexican authorities pursued each tip with care, aware of the gravity of the case. Their efforts finally paid off when they pinpointed Lorien in the small town of Tacambaro, Michoacán. News quickly reached Jacksonville, sparking a wave of relief and anticipation among those who had been closely following the case. When Mexican police, with U.S. Marshals on standby, moved in to make the arrest, there was a tense moment of uncertainty. Lorien had managed to elude capture for months, but his luck had run out. The news of his arrest traveled quickly, reaching the Lauterbach family, who had been waiting for answers. For Mary Lauterbach, the knowledge that Lorien was now in custody brought a small but crucial measure of peace. Lorien's extradition process began immediately, as U.S. authorities prepared to bring him back to North Carolina. After months on the run, he was set to face a courtroom where Mariah's family, her fellow Marines, and an entire community sought justice for her untimely death. Back in North Carolina, the courtroom became a focal point for those seeking accountability. The trial would be long and complex, a painful reminder of everything Maria had endured. Each piece of evidence, every testimony, painted a picture of a young woman who had trusted the wrong person and suffered the consequences. Lorien's defense attempted to cast doubt on the accusations, but the evidence was overwhelming. As the case against him unfolded, the prosecution left little room for ambiguity. The details were difficult to listen to, and the courtroom was somber as witnesses recounted the investigation's findings. The trial reached its emotional climax as prosecutors laid out the case against Cesar Lorien with a sense of finality. Each witness, each piece of evidence reinforced the portrait of a deliberate and calculated crime. The jury listened intently as Mariah's story unfolded in stark detail. For those gathered in the courtroom, the impact of the testimony was undeniable, especially for Mariah's family, who had waited so long for this day. Mary Lauterbach sat quietly, her face a mixture of strength and sorrow. She had endured every agonizing turn of the investigation and every attempt by the defense to cast doubt on the truth. And now, as the final witnesses took the stand, there was a sense that justice, long delayed, might finally be within reach. Maria's friends and former colleagues in the Marine Corps also filled the room, standing as silent witnesses to a tragedy that had affected their lives and shaken their sense of security. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor reminded the jury of the evidence, Lorien's evasive actions, the disturbing attempts to conceal his crime, and the unshakable courage of Maria, who had sought justice even when it had placed her in harm's way. As the prosecutor spoke, a somber stillness settled over the courtroom. The weight of the case, the loss of a young woman's life, seemed to hang in the air. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, the tension was palpable. Lorien stood motionless as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The courtroom reacted with quiet relief. Justice had been served, and Mariah's voice had finally been heard. Outside, the Lauterbach family and supporters gathered in solidarity. Mary spoke briefly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of years of pain. She thanked those who had supported her and honored Maria's memory, expressing a hope that her daughter's story would serve as a reminder of courage in the face of fear. In the days that followed, the town of Jacksonville found a sense of closure, though the memory of Mariah's life and the tragic events remained vivid. Her fellow Marines and family carried her legacy forward, ensuring that her strength and dedication would not be forgotten. If today's stories left you shocked, heartbroken, or reflecting on the challenges women face in a world that doesn't always protect them, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of our daily uploads. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about these cases, and how can we learn from them to create a safer, more just world? Thank you for watching, and remember, raising awareness and demanding justice can make a difference. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.